There's no going back to that. So none can even read.
That was none other than Dinosaur Jr. Thank you, Paul, for that. I know that's high on the list, on the playlist of most of our participants, and they all recognize that. Hey, welcome to Friday. It's another opportunity for us to do lunch with friends and strangers. It's always such a joy. It's actually perhaps the most fun program I do, and it's nice that we do it on Friday. Good way to kick off the weekend. I want to thank a few. You saw our thanks to our sponsor. I want to thank the Cotton Mercury Group and Morgan Stanley for helping support Carolina Public Humanities and our Carolina K-12 programs. I also want to thank, of course, Carolina Meadows, a retirement community at Chapel Hill, for being such a great partner with us and supporting both of our public programs and our K-12 programs. And in particular, the General Alumni Association, who is our partner in this project, as well as many others this fall. And as we work with the GAA all the time, but in the virtual world, we're really happy to be working with them and reaching as many people far and wide as we can. In particular, I want to thank Kat Nichols, who helped organize this event with us. And we hope to do more in the spring. So tell your friends. Also, I want to remind folks, if you like these biography talks, they are all available on Carolina Public Humanities YouTube site. There's a whole playlist, Lunch with Friends and Strangers. You can go back and look at some of the great conversations we've had and some of the people we've talked to, both friends, faculty, and strangers. Let's get right to it and invite our friend. Come on in, Dr. Karin Pfennig. Where there? Hello, hey. There you are. Hi. Welcome. Karin is a doctor. I'm going to call you Karin if that's okay. I'm not going. Yes. We get rid of all formalities. A professor of biology here at the university, and one of our great humanist biologists. We have a few of them here, actually. And it's a wonderful sign of true scholars are those that can talk across disciplines. And so I'm really pleased that you're here. And I'm also really excited to be talking about a scientist. You know, we don't do this very often where we get to engage in these and meet these types of people. So really interesting. Maybe we should, let me just ask you, how are you? Are things good in your world?
I'm good, yes.
Good. Thank you. I asked you earlier in our preliminary conversation, you know, what the biology lab or whatever looks like in the days of COVID, and you're sort of just like us.
A little shut down, yeah. So, other people are more active, but yeah.
Well, and I'm sure that we're looking forward to normality coming, but let's have we'll pretend this is normal. Pretend we're eating lunch together at a table and we're in 3D. So let's meet our person. This is not I would maybe do an informal poll among our people who have joined us today. How many people have heard of well, Joseph Leidy? Right. Okay, so let's get the big picture. If you had to say, Karin, if someone said to you, okay, give me the elevator talk, who is Joseph Leidy?
Yeah, so Joseph Leidy is considered justifiably maybe the father of American paleontology, so the study of ancient life, especially discovering many of the dinosaur species that were discovered out in the Western US. And he is also at the same time the father of American parasitology. Parasitology is the study of parasites. And so that's, which are two very different things in terms of what he has
very
done.
Big and very small.
Exactly.
Often when I think about it.
Exactly. And so that's kind of what he and he was in his day, he was actually one of the most prominent scientists in the US. And you know, he's basically an obscure figure now, but during his lifetime, he was quite famous, known to people like Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, so many of the people who have remained as leading figures in science and in those areas, Leidy was known to them and was a remarkable figure at his time. So,
you had mentioned that there's not many, not many people are memorializing or remembering him. There is a book, I think I have the picture right here. Let me see, this Last Man Who Knew Everything by Leonard Warren.
Right.
But you're not going to find many other texts just dedicated to Joseph Leidy.
Yeah, and it's not really one of the things I find interesting about him is sort of that enigmatic aspect of why some scientists become so famous and well known in their time and then disappear into obscurity. And there's some, we can speculate about why that's so. I think, in Warren's book, he makes the case that Lighty was doing his work at a time of transition in American science where you have sort of the more descriptive natural history components, which is what he was really quite good at. But he, at a time when biology especially, but science was moving into much more empirical, theory-driven approaches. He became kind of old-fashioned even towards the end of his lifetime, and I think he was eclipsed by a new way of thinking and doing science, and also by people who were a lot more ambitious, and so there's a strange thing of a man who he wasn't a particularly he was ambitious, but not to the point of really driving himself forward in ways that many more charismatic scientists are good at.
And I like that title, the last man who knew everything. It sounds like that's a sort of an old way of thinking about knowledge, sort of
Right.
encyclopedic knowledge of a broad view. When you look at science, it's wrapped up into a systemic view of the world. Is that
Right.
accurate for Lighty? Is he sort of in that 19th century idea of sort of philosophy, the mother of all sciences?
Well, very much so, and he was just very curious about the natural world, and his it seems that the one thing that really drove him was just loving to go out and explore and describe all that he saw out there. And there's this anecdote of Harvard trying to recruit him away from the University of Pennsylvania, and I think it was in his decline letter. It's either Harvard or Princeton. They were both tried to recruit him. He said, "Well, I'll leave Philadelphia when I've run out of things to study in Philadelphia," right? And so he could continue to discover, new species, new organisms in his backyard or that people sent to him, and he just maintained that kind of, curiosity about the natural world in ways that is really not promoted by science these days. And the love and the description of nature for its own sake, as opposed to being motivated by particular reasons, right? So like modern science is often motivated by what is this going to do to help humans do X, right? What is this going to do to help cure cancer? Or what is this going to do to help clean up the environment? What is this going to do to, as one of the ranchers out where I work, said, put more McDonald's hamburgers on the tables of Americans, right? That's what often motivates science now. And Leidy comes from a time when you could just study and observe the beauties of nature for their own sake and find joy in that. And he really truly found joy in that kind of discovery and that kind of description of nature. And he was also very effective at sharing that joy with others.
It's interesting. I mean, it's I think of sort of the ecological approach to thinking about biology I always associate that as a product of the 20th century. And thinking about, looking at systems in biology. Is his appreciation for nature as it was sort of a precursor of an ecological appreciation for nature, or is just simply observational?
I think it's more observational. I don't think he necessarily thought in those kinds of ways, and that's actually one of some of the criticisms of him. I think we'll talk about one of his discoveries. He was actually the one who discovered that the parasite that causes trichinosis is found in ham. But he never followed up on that to say, okay, what is the full life cycle of this parasite? It was his discovery that sort of helped other people, discover the relationships and fully describe the disease. He was perfectly happy to just discover and describe this parasite in the breakfast ham, and he speculated that it was the cause of the disease, and he actually became an outspoken voice for public health taking, in cleanliness and sanitation, but he
So
didn't
how
think in
much do
those
we have
terms.
to, we'll look at that. We have
Yeah.
some pictures of the trichinosis. We'll look at that a little bit later, but just a brief, how much do we have to blame Joseph Leidy for our parents overcooking pork for so long? And we realize it only has to be cooked to 120 or so degrees to kill the,
Maybe not him, although he was a big proponent of cooking your meat and getting rid of
I bet.
parasites. Yeah.
Well, let's meet him a little bit more intimately.
Okay.
What do we know about his early life?
Yeah, so he grew up in Philadelphia. He was the son of a man who, and I can't remember the parents' names. Well, not his father's name. His father was a hatter. So sort of just middle class,
Mhm.
mercantile person, well respected man, um, but a little bit narrow-minded in terms of the way he thought about the world and what his sons should do in terms of success, which is
So
just get
he
a
was of
job.
German extraction.
Correct. That's
And do
right.
we know how far back that goes, or were there German elements in his, were they
Yeah, so
speaking German?
they were speaking German in the household. I think it was his great grandfather that was the first to immigrate to the
Okay.
US. I'm not 100% sure about that, but they were speaking German in the household. It was actually his mother. Well, his stepmother. His mother died when he was quite young, his biological mother, and his father married her cousin, Christiana, who was apparently a really remarkable and outspoken woman. And one of the things she did was read poetry and have them read to learn English because German was being spoken in the home. So she did a lot of reading and getting the family to read together, things like Shakespeare, poetry, and apparently she, would have them acting it out. So there was almost an encouragement of her to maybe even go on the stage, type of thing. But she was happy to just do that in the household. And Lighty really looks to her as being, everything that shaped who he was. And she was actually the person who promoted Lighty's skills. As a naturalist, his father noted that he was very good at drawing when he was young, and so he
Mhm.
thought, well, this kid will be a good sign painter. And so his ambition for Joseph was to become a painter of signs because he could earn a living with his
Yeah.
artistic abilities.
Not an
Um,
artist, a sign
a
painter,
sign painter.
So I want to keep you, he was born in 1823, gives us a
Right.
sense of, so by the time the mid 1830s, I mean, is he getting an education outside of the house early?
Yeah, so his mother actually arranged for him, a little bit in defiance of the father, to send him to a private school where he could learn Latin and be educated be more formally educated. And then she also gave him sort of free rein to go out and be a naturalist and explore the world outside of the home. So she allowed him to sort of pursue his passions and stood up to dad to keep him from doing, sort of squashing those ambitions.
So just I want to remind folks, you can put questions in the Q&A tab down here. Arlene Metter has a thing in the chat. Do you know if his father had mercury poisoning from Hatter's disease or Hatter's
Gosh.
disease?
No, I don't know. Although he lived I think he lived into his 80s. So I don't think he did suffer from that. Although
Take your
it's
mercury
interesting.
tablets every day, folks.
It's
Don't.
interesting because Lighty in his later age, he was often exposed to a lot of chemicals, and he speculated that a lot of the chemicals that were in the water, that people were being continuously exposed to, were poisoning people. So Joseph Leidy was actually very aware of the environment that people were experiencing could be toxic to them, and in his later life, fought for reforms of clean water, public health, and reductions of toxins that people were exposing themselves to.
So I'm going to pull up that. This is a little bit out of order here. When does he matriculate into college and his career?
Yeah, so he- gosh, I can't remember
I don't,
the
you don't need
details of the
dates, but
dates,
that's
but
what I tell my students, just the
yeah.
general stuff.
I was terrible at history. So his big transition came from starting to make the acquaintance of some of the more rich and powerful people. And I think this is where the sort of theme that I see in Leidy's life is that he gets noticed for his talents in natural history by more rich and powerful people who start to
Mhm.
provide him with opportunities for things like internships and assistantships. So he became I guess a demonstrator, basically an assistant to a professor teaching anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania, and that was a way that he could help earn his living. Um, but really, in sort of the early part of his career, the compromise with his father was he would go and learn to be a physician, and so he actually got his MD and became a
Mhm.
doctor, set up practice as a physician. And one of my favorite stories is that when he first had his first patient walk through the gate, he locked the door and ran and hid because he was terrified of the thought of having to actually practice medicine.
What a
Um,
responsibility it is,
I
right?
know it is, and
So,
he really did not like it. And
so
so
he does not just practice medicine; he ends up teaching medicine as well. Because you
he
would give us this wonderful picture of him at the University of Pennsylvania. When does this start? Does he have a private career in practice for a while before he's brought into the teaching, or was he just always around this academic environment?
Well, so so he starts out in practice, but he's also associated with the Academy of Natural Sciences. He's still doing his natural history work sort of in the background as he is a practicing physician. And my impression is that the practice as a physician was never particularly good. Given that he tended to run away from clients, and so he basically did a lot of odd jobs. So he worked to help do autopsies and do forensic
Mhm.
science. And so one of the things he's actually credited for is probably being the first person in the US to solve a crime using microscopic evidence. So,
Wow.
then this was while he's working in, the coroner's office. He also was assisting the main professor of anatomy. So basically helping to set up the demonstrations where people were doing the dissections and things like that.
So in this photograph, we clearly have, this is Lighty here. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. We clearly have an older Lighty here
Right, right.
in the University of Pennsylvania. At this point, all of his work with anatomy, helping other professors, has gotten him obviously a position. He's
Correct.
eventually a professor of anatomy or a professor of medicine.
Right. So when when his mentor, who was the professor of anatomy, there was one at the time, died, it was some of his powerful friends who basically nominated him for this position. And I think this was in his late 20s or so.
Mhm.
And that would have provided him with a secure, you know, s- secure income and secure position. And there were some powerful people who fought against him having this position, but he persevered. He and was ultimately the one who was named into this position as professor. Ironically, he actually even did the autopsy on the man who had been his mentor. If I'm remembering it correct, which is a little grotesque, but I don't know.
I guess if you're used to cutting up the
Yeah,
bodies, it
that's
doesn't
right.
matter.
That's right.
So,
Um,
and this is such an interesting picture. I know in our early preliminary discussion, we are looking at it's completely male,
right.
um,
That's right.
completely white.
Great.
And
Yeah.
so
um,
Lighty is, he checks those two boxes off. Can you speak a
right.
little bit about his sense of the scientific community? Did he sense its limitations or in the 19th century? That's asking a lot for someone to think outside of the norms of their age, but what was his perspective on the scientific community itself and some of the things we've just discussed, its limited clientele, if you will?
Well, so my guess is that at some level he was very aware of it. I'm not incredibly familiar with it, but a lot of naturalists at the time Leidy was coming into his own. This was the realm of the rich, right? And science was the realm of the rich, and he's coming from a much more middle class background where access to that is going to be very limited. And so one of the things that he did, and I don't think he did this intentionally in the sense of, you know, I, I don't know, out of the drive to get ahead, out of you know, just sort of naked ambition, is he cultivated relationships with other people. I mean, he was described as being this really sweet, really gentle man who was an incredibly talented naturalist, and so he developed relationships with people who were themselves very powerful and basically kind of became his patrons. Who, even though he was not necessarily someone who would urge his case forward, they urged his case forward
Mhm.
on his behalf. And I think he was aware of that. That he, you know, he. I mean, I speculate that he was aware of that. I mean, he was good to all of his friends, um, and you know, he never did things. He was not somebody to basically, you know, do anything that would break friendships. And
Mhm.
so, whether he did that intentionally or not, it certainly benefited him throughout his career, these kinds of connections.
Yeah,
But I
it's so
say that,
funny. We forget about the soft skills, right? You know,
right.
of people and how they contribute to success. Just on his medical career, I noticed that also we had this. Let me just pull up. You know, he publishes Lighty's Anatomy here. So he's getting some notoriety in the medical field for sure, right?
Right. So he was not just famous for, you know, his natural history, but comparative anatomy was an important part of his contributions as well. And so, you know, and this was a man who, you know, he did the range of things that he did is really quite remarkable. So I mentioned that, you know, he's the first one who solved a murder case, you know, using microscopic evidence. He was also apparently one of the first people to actually transplant cancer cells, a part of a cancer tumor, into another species and see that it actually grew. So, you know, this is something that just kind of
Yeah.
completely got ignored, but you know, this could have been the foundation of cancer biology. And, you know, he's just kind of tinkering around, just sort of following
It's
his
interesting.
nose for stuff.
He sees, and you know, we talked about the trichinosis thing. He sees this connection between the natural world that he's observing and the medical world that he's,
Right.
you know, so how did this come just through observation?
Yeah, he literally saw it in his breakfast ham. I mean, like, so he, he just got, I mean, this is a man who would pick up the meat on his table and pick it apart to look for parasites. And, you know, he discovered this and said, okay, maybe this is where this disease is coming from. Now, he just described it. He just described the parasite cyst in the ham, and that was the sum total of his contribution. But it's an important one because now the people who do want to follow through with understanding this life cycle of this parasite and the role that it plays in human
Mhm.
disease have this basic fact that they can build on. But again, you know, this is the flip side of this, is that this is one of the criticisms of Leidy, is that, you know, he would do something like this and then not really follow through on it. It was kind of like, oh, there's this in my breakfast ham. This is probably the cause of trichinosis. I'll publish this, and then, you know, he'll
Move
then
on.
find a worm in, you know, tomorrow's dinner fish. And
Just a curiosity about
yeah.
trichinosis. Was it very common? I mean, and how does was it curable? And how, you know, so how common was this for people to get, and what are its manifestations? It's a word I've always heard, trichinosis, but I've never actually thought about what it actually, how it manifests
Yeah,
itself.
so I don't know a whole lot of details about the disease. I think back then it was fairly common because basically it's something where you can get this parasite if you ingest it. The parasite then moves into muscle tissue, right?
Mm,
And so it can cause
which is
it
the
can
meat,
cause
right? It's
pain. Yeah, it just moves
right,
into you,
into
into
our
your
ham.
muscle tissue. Yeah, and cause problems to the point where it can be quite severe. So,
Yeah,
right, if it gets into your heart muscle,
yeah,
then you can cause heart failure. So
yeah.
it is a very serious illness. I'm not actually sure how it was cured.
Well, I will
or
say
has
this,
cured
we
him.
have a wonderful Paul Bonici who's does such great work here, has also put up here some tips on how to cook pork down here in the chat. So thank you for that, Paul. It's very important for us. Well, I want
Well,
to, and you mentioned one other thing about Lighty was his, that getting into the world of being a naturalist was very much of a upper class kind of thing. And I mentioned to you, I just want to go back. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction here. Sorry, everyone. This is from his collection here.
right.
These are things he collected. This was very much of a gentleman's thing to do, but he did it out of his own sense of curiosity, and he found the time to do this,
That's
obviously.
right. That's right. And so, so there's sort of two elements to the way in which Lighty did his natural history. There was his own exploration of the world, and especially as when he was young, he and his friend, so there's actually a young man. He was a black man who helped at the Hatter shop, and there were some issues. Sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but there were some issues in terms of threats of beating up some of these kids who were at these schools, and so Lighty's mom paid this boy to go out with Joseph out on their rambles. And so they actually would go out together and became fast friends, and were friends for the rest of their lives, of going out and just exploring, gathering natural history specimens, whatever they were, whether it was botanical specimens, anything like that. And so that part of exploration was describing and just looking at the natural world. And he would he'd go to his fishmonger, and he was friends with his fishmonger, and he'd buy food for the table and also look for parasites and specimens inside
Cool.
the food he was bringing home.
And like a good Philadelphia person, he went to Atlantic City, goes to the Jersey
Right.
coast. We all know about that's
right.
where Philadelphians go. Um,
But
that's
so there's that component, but the other component of being a naturalist, especially with his association with the Academy of Natural Sciences, is that then people send things to the museum for description or to ask questions. So I found this. What is this bone? And so that's where Lighty also became really well known, because he would answer questions about things that people find and then send to him, whether primarily other scientists, but other naturalists out there would seek his advice. And so he would get a lot of material that way, where things are just sent to him for formal descriptions.
Yeah, very interesting. It's a couple of things. We're gonna not spend as much time on some of these, but I just think it's interesting that his reputation is such that by a certain point he's being, as you mentioned, being called upon for his expertise by sort of in an informal way. He's invited to also be part of Swarthmore, one of the first coeducational colleges in the country.
Right.
How is this just based on his reputation as a physician, as a anatomist, or natural scientist, or both?
Well, both really. And so, he's teaching some of the early classes there, and also building up their teaching collection. So, in terms of acquiring material, the kinds of specimens you just showed that he could bring into the classroom and use to teach students things like, comparative anatomy, different aspects of natural history, basic biology. He helps build up the collections they use in their teaching, but he's also teaching classes at Swarthmore. And there's sort of the line from the Warren book, the second president of Swarthmore sort of knew he was onto a good thing in terms of having Lighty there. His popularity, he was a big draw, and sort of induced him to teach more than he was initially just brought in to teach one class. And so, he increased the number of classes he was teaching, gave him free reign to help build up the teaching materials, and really help build a department that would ultimately be the natural sciences that were found sort of form the foundation of natural sciences at Swarthmore.
And of course, this becomes, his reputation is such that this is he becomes a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences. Can we talk a little bit about the institute, like the institutional existence of natural sciences and where it fit in the world? We knew that there was a sort of a hobby of the generalists, the aristocrats, if you will, going out and collecting specimens. But there's also hard science. And what is the crossover between institutes like the Academy and the informality of the era? Is this,
Right.
go ahead.
Yeah, so this is, well, so it, sort of in the early days of this, it sort of has a lot more of a sort of clubby atmosphere in terms of, people getting together and sharing specimens, doing presentations or submitting papers, so presenting papers that are describing specimens. And as you say, some of the early founders are of the Academy are wealthy, prestigious people in Philadelphia society with a strong interest in the natural sciences and in natural history. And as the collections grow, so you have these natural historians sort of basically collecting and putting things in, there is a little bit of a tension of, is this going to continue to be, a group of scientists who are just sort of focused on doing natural history? Are we going to open this up to the public? And there's some contentiousness about what is the role of something like this in the community. Is it something just for the club, or is it something where we open it up and provide access for the general public to come in? And in the early days of the society, as it started to move to being something that was more a part of the community, there was, the prevailing view was minimize the public access to these kinds of places, and I think one of the rules was children under 16 were not even allowed inside. Right?
Come on!
Because they might break something, right? And so so there was very much restricted access on that. And one of the things,
Karin, I'm just looking at this picture down here and seeing these, skeletons and stuff. You're not going to let little kids come and see these,
right. Well, and that's, it's kind of something we don't think about now, because obviously we want the public to come into these kinds of collections, because, or aspects of the collections. I mean, what we see now in museums are only a small fraction of what are really there, right? We don't actually even allow the public to see the major part of the resources that are museums these days, because they are so critical to research. What we do now is, of course, we have the sort of public face of museums that have the, key exhibition, the part that gets the public excited and supports the museum, but the really heavy duty labor of research is done behind closed doors or even off site, for some museums, right? And so, that's an important consideration, is that museums have both of those. I think they still do face that dual, challenge of investment in the research mission and protection of those really vital specimens, versus the sort of public sphere. And throughout his career, Lighty was associated with the Academy for basically almost all of his professional life. And he was part of the ongoing conversation and debates that ultimately shaped what the Academy looked like. And for right or wrong, especially at the end, and this is where he didn't want to offend his friends, there were a lot of people who were pushing for reform of the Academy of Natural Sciences at the end of his life. And he was afraid to offend some of his, friends who were also rich and powerful, who wanted to not move into sort of the modern scientific approach. They wanted to continue the sort of old school descriptive, stuff in jars, just describe it type of approach to science. And, that was not the future. And so, whether or not the reason for the decline of the prominence of the Academy of Natural Sciences is related to that is potentially debatable. But, the Academy of Natural Sciences used to be the premier, scientific academy in American science. And that's not the case anymore. So.
Well, we have to get to the important stuff.
Okay.
Nice. if we don't address
Dinosaurs.
the dinosaur in the room, then we're not doing our job here.
Right.
So I just took a little trip back to, this is probably I bet these species didn't even exist in the same time or place together,
Probably
but
not.
they're here with me now. So let's talk about dinosaurs. How did this whole thing start? How does Joseph Leidy get involved in this?
Well, so a lot of it has to do with, again, this other aspect of natural history study where people send you stuff to describe. And so Lighty started to receive fossil material as it was coming from out west, and also in different parts of the east, where especially given both his natural history, just really intuitive sense of natural history, but comparative anatomy, which is a really valuable way of being able to understand what something looks like based on, a handful of bones. Um, they sent him he started to receive this fossil material to describe and understand how does it all fit together and piece together. And so he really became the go-to person when you have weird things turn up, so to speak.
Mhm.
Send them to Lighty and he can figure out what it is. And he had a good friend at the Smithsonian who was sort of also a source to ensure that he received this material to
So
describe.
a few things to be clear, so we can't get into too much more detail with the amount of
Mhm.
time we have, but he believed in evolution.
Oh,
He
absolutely.
and so he already has taken a crack at some of the theology that was holding science back. In terms of when he looked at these dinosaur bones, did he understand them to be a product of a deep conception of time that many people even, were debating how old the Earth was? We didn't have
Right.
radiocarbon to know these things. How did he situate this in a sense of time, and did he address it?
Well, so he absolutely was a supporter of evolution. He loved Origin of Species and Darwin's work, and in fact, Lighty was instrumental in getting Darwin appointed a fellow of the Academy of Natural Sciences for his work. So he was a big fan. And it was not only just struggling with deep time, but even the origins of life. Spontaneous generation, which is the notion that you could put straw in a bag and worms come out,
Mhm.
type of notion, that was still around as an idea. And so he rejected the idea of spontaneous generation, thought it was ridiculous. So he understood that in the same way that Darwin did, coming from the work by Lyell and geologists who understood that time was deep, that there are forms of life that have gone extinct, and that the world looked very different from what we see today. He fully understood that, and he
Mhm.
actually saw, in terms of the religious connotations, the one time people know he got mad was when he was accused of being an atheist. He was not an atheist, but he also had no problem with understanding that the world changes, that evolution happens. And, he wasn't sure of the mechanisms, but yes, he recognized that element of
And
that.
not everything in dinosaur studies is peaceful. I'm going to ask you what this
Yeah.
means.
Okay.
Dinosaur war. What are we
The
talking about
dinosaur
here?
wars. Yeah. So on the let's see, my left, so the guy with the long beard is
Mhm.
Othniel Marsh, from the Yale Peabody Museum. And to the right is Edward Drinker Cope, who Cope was actually associated with the Academy of Natural Sciences, and he was a student of Lighty. Really, he begged his father to take him to Lighty's lectures at Penn when he was a kid. So he grew up just hero worshiping Lighty at some level. But both men were incredibly driven, driven in a sense of wanting to make names for themselves. And they saw paleontology, basically, they were both paleontologists at a time when paleontology was just getting started in the US. And um, what what happened is they started competing with one another for access to fossil sites, for access to describing specimens, to be the first to name a species, right? That's kind
Mhm.
of for them, that was, you know, a way of establishing their fame and establishing their legacy. And it turned really quite acrimonious. It was something where, you know, there are stories of, you know, dynamiting fossil sites to prevent the other side from getting in. There
There's got
are,
to be
you
a
know,
movie in the works on this.
there have been documentaries, there have been numerous books, because, you know, it made it into the papers. So this
Mhm.
was something they basically ruined each other ultimately in terms of their careers. And it, you know, they would write in the newspapers about each other. And, you know, this was a world before pop stars. So, you know, people were paying attention to what famous scientists were doing to each other.
Well, it's interesting, but Leidy himself never got into these sort of contentious battles.
No, he did not, and he was actually really, completely turned off by the whole acrimonious interaction between them. And, you know, one of the sort of highlights is a horrible mistake that Cope made, and this really sort of, made things even worse, where there's this, you know, we have this long uh, species, Elasmosaur, and he put the head on the tail
Oh yeah,
and
we have
tried
an
to publish
expression,
it.
ass backwards.
Yeah. Well, so Marsh came in and said, you know, I think there's something wrong here. It's the reverse. And so they called on Lighty to actually to to basically decide who is right. And, you know, the story goes that Lighty just silently went, took the head off the tail and put it where it belongs, right? So he just saw right away that it was a mistake.
So
Um,
so
but
it's
yeah,
interesting, you know, here's this dinosaur wars between these two. They're out there doing this. Leidy, how does he establish himself as like the granddaddy of the dinosaur? You know, like that they would go to him, and he's what was he doing? He was collecting these fossils as well, but not involved in the wars. How did he get that stature?
well, so he was already very prominent in paleontology. So he was, you know, so he was really the first person to be describing these two are sort of the next generation, so to speak, coming along after him. Well, not quite the next generation, but, you know, one of the frustrations for Leidy was that he he could not compete with them, and he felt like, you know, aside from not wanting any part of, you know, this really acrimonious feud, and apparently there was so he Leidy would himself go out west to collect fossils, and apparently at a site out in Utah, it's either Utah or Montana, there was some sort of altercation, and it's not clear what happened. Um, it's not been spoken of apparently, but Leidy just said that's it, and he didn't want to have anything more to do with it. And one of the things that actually interested me about Leidy was watching a documentary about these bone wars, this war between Cope and Marsh, and, you know, hearing this man who just walked away from it, right? He
Yeah.
was the leader in the field. He was the expert, and these two people came along and spoiled it for him, and his
Oh,
response was to walk away. And he just, you know, to go back to you know, his natural history in terms of just studying invertebrates and
these are later pictures
the
of his here on
parasites.
the screen. These are
Yeah,
some of his
some of his
post dinosaur work, but going back to description, going back
right.
to analysis. And what beautiful drawings
Yeah,
too. So
yeah,
glad he didn't become a sign painter.
right.
Well, you know, this is such an interesting, and you know, we do want to get to some questions.
Okay.
We want to talk a little bit about, you know, his legacy. When did he die? Did he die content with his life, and was he celebrated at his death?
Yeah, so he was celebrated at his death. He was, you know, just really, you know, people. He died in his late 60s. You know, he had an incredibly happy family life. He was, uh, you know, just somebody who had, you know, devoted friends. He was devoted to his friends, and you know, as I said, you know, he was somebody who, you know, Harvard recruited, Princeton recruited. He was, you know, internationally renowned. And so, yeah, when he died, it was a major blow. And even though people recognized that, you know, yes, some of his work was even at the time becoming old fashioned, so to speak. I mean, his work is really quite foundational in terms of just the basic natural history that you have to understand if you want to build up on understanding relationships, to take a more, as you say, systematic or relational view in science. You just have to know those basic natural history facts. So,
Mhm.
one of the things that Lighty provides us with is that information that, even though we don't necessarily ascribe it to him, we have a lot to thank him for in terms of this, basic understanding.
Well, it's
Yeah.
really fascinating, and I know we could, if folks are interested, they can go to Lighty Peak out in
Yep,
Utah. Is that right?
that's right, in the Uinta Mountains,
And
out in Utah.
did he ever go in this area himself looking?
He did. So the fort, there's a Fort Bridger that is one of the fossil sites that he was at. That was actually the site where of the unnamed incident. Yes, this is in an area where some major fossil collection sites. So Dinosaur National Monument is not too far to
Mhm.
the east of this site out in
Very
Utah.
cool. Well,
Yeah.
fascinating figure. And I know, just like we always do, we just scratch the surface. It
Yeah.
sounds like there's so much more, but
There is.
let's get to a few of our questions and see what
Sure.
people have, see what kind of questions they have. Arlene Metter asked, was he married or otherwise rely on someone to handle the non-scientific portions of his life?
Oh, yes. So what a great question. And this is one of the really enigmatic things about him. He was married to a woman named Anna. How they met, nobody knows. How they courted, nobody knows. It was sort of like he just up and married this woman. And she was devoted to him. He was devoted to her. They were incredibly happy. And she helped him in his work. She was interested in science in her own right, and he gives her full credit for helping with drawings, helping with some of the descriptions. She actually, at one point, joined the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, which is one of the major scientific societies, and attended the meetings in her own right in his absence when he didn't attend. So she was an important component of that. The flip, so she did make the home. She did sort of run the house, and he
Mhm.
did have a butler servant later in life that was devoted to him. But the note is that he always did the shopping because he wanted, and the idea was that because he was so fixated on parasites, he probably figured he knew best.
I'm sorry. For all that I'm
What to
admiring
eat.
Joseph Leidy, I don't think I'd want to have dinner with him. It's picking apart to me. Tom Zitlow had a similar question about married, but also about children.
Yeah.
Did he have children, and did he encourage them in their scientific pursuits?
So he and Anna adopted the daughter of a friend, of another professor at Penn who died. Both of the parents of the girl died, so they raised her as their own. And he encouraged children just in general. There's sort of this remark about him as being just always open, always willing to have kids come up and look at the microscopes and get them excited. They describe a student who lived with the family describes him just sitting among the family doing his work with his microscope, and he kids would be running around or people just talking, and he would just look up every now and again and participate or call them over to have a look at what's in the microscope. And so he was very much integrated with the family, and the family integrated with him and what he was doing. He didn't separate those in that kind of way.
It's just, it's
So,
it's funny how, we can never really know, and I'm sure we'd find a lot of difference with people. Like if we were to just sort of be put, dropped into the 19th century into Joseph Leidy's room, we might find out some other things about him. But it is remarkable how consistent this language is, that he's just a really nice guy.
yeah.
And,
Well,
and,
yeah,
and also sort of has, I think that comes from a sort of a patience in his
mhm,
approach to science, and a patience in his approach to, just observational. Let's kind of like roll with the punches here.
right. Well, yeah,
Are,
one of his students described him as the sweetest man he'd ever met. And it's like what a nice thing to say about somebody, right? To be
oh
described
gosh,
as
yeah,
sweet,
yeah. I read my evaluations. He was all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. um, Arlene Metter, of course, in those days they often exhibited original skeletons, not replicas, right?
Right,
And so much
right,
more fragile, right? So,
right,
uh,
right.
was he putting these? So, was he reconstructing these skeletons and displaying them? Was he part of that process, or was he more just kind of interested in finding them and categorizing them?
Well, so part of the process of describing them would have been to sort of assemble them and reconstruct them. And so he would have been doing that for sure, is part of the description. But one of the things that Leidy was not good at, that Cope and Marsh, which really sort of ushered in the major way of thinking about paleontology, was, think about your background. He wasn't into that kind of artistic, speculation or anything like that. Marsh and Cope were much better about conveying the excitement of dinosaurs and the world they lived in, and bringing in artists to try and share that. And Lighty was not good at that and not
Yeah.
interested. And people really describe his writings and his the way he thought about things as kind of dry. And it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was only in interacting with him personally that you really got his sense of joy and wonder.
It's a sense that he's limited by his observational nature in a way, and that, look behind me. Well, it's not really there, but this sort of fanciful idea of, this is the limitations are, here are the skeletons, this is what I put together, this is the way anatomy works, I'm able to use my knowledge of natural sciences to do this. Someone else is going to have to do that imaginative work or whatnot.
Right.
It is, I mean, as a child, I, of course, I don't think I'm alone in this, loved dinosaurs. The whole idea of dinosaurs was an industry of dinosaurs, dinosaur books, and it's still out there. And that, Lighty has to be there for that to be there, but Lighty it's a different road to take from Lighty to that, isn't it?
Right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, and he was just somebody who was just unwilling to speculate. And, he really felt like you needed to have the data, the observations, the descriptions. And, this is where, again, part of the criticism of him is that, like dinosaurs and the evidence that Cope and Marsh assembled were some of the best evidence for Darwin, in terms of like the evolution of horses, for example, seeing these sort of transitions from a very small mammal to what we see today. Lighty would not even sort of try to even build those kinds of relationships the way that Cope and Marsh strive to do. And so he really did not place things into that kind of imaginative, speculative, broader context, which is where science ultimately ended up going, right?
But he's also, I mean, it sounds to me like if you were to come to him with rational explanations, he might not be the person to do it, but he would accept these. Would he accept these, or did he fight? So that's very interesting.
Absolutely. I think, especially if you had the sort of convincing data, and that was one of the things he loved about, on Origin of Species, is that Darwin provided the data. And so it wasn't speculative anymore. It's like, yeah, you nailed it. And, and he did the same thing in terms of, in thinking about, the issues of spontaneous generation, he just like, there's just no evidence consistent with that. So he would speculate in the sense that life has to have arisen from other life forms rather than just being created in some way, but for him, the evidence of nature was overwhelming, suggesting that, right? And so
I suppose it could be limiting too, right? In a sense, if like, so for example, I know growing up we had this notion, because we thought of dinosaurs as lizards, and we thought of them as cold-blooded, and we thought of them as, and then the whole bird hypothesis comes out. And, and I guess what I'm suggesting is that if you're a natural scientist and you're looking at the natural world and you're making comparisons and whatnot, it would be a natural assumption. Every lizard that I've looked at seems to be, slow moving, or not slow. No, actually lizards can be very fast moving, cold blood, but you could tell I'm a humanist, but you still understand my point I'm making, is that, in some ways it can be limiting, right? And if you're always observational and not taking that little step of speculation. But of course, the bird hypothesis is based off of observation as well.
It is, and comparative anatomy at some level. So, so it's not that crazy. So yeah, I mean, I it's not clear to me if part of the reason that he wasn't willing to speculate had more to do with his omnivorous tendencies, to just sort of like, he satisfied his curiosity about a particular specimen and moved on, as opposed to, if I take this cancer tumor and transplant it into a frog and see that it grows, what are the next possible steps? It's like, oh, it just grew. That was enough for him. And so, it's I guess it's more an issue of, was it his turn of mind in terms of just being always interested in something else? Because, some of the speculation and hypothesis testing requires a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of following up on those initial observations. And maybe he just didn't have the inclination to do that. Yeah.
So I have two questions here. We're going to wrap up and kind of combine these questions.
Okay.
Tom Zitlow asks, even though he was quote unquote old school, why hasn't he been rediscovered? And Catherine Nichols from the GAA, hello, Kat, asks, could he have a career like he did in more modern times? So why isn't he being discovered, and where would he fit in the modern scientific world?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think to answer the first, the what would he fit in the modern world? I don't think he would succeed in the same way he did now. I think he could be somebody who, he could be somebody, let me put it back. He would not be somebody who would be able to be hired at a Research One institution, right? He would not be somebody who would be able to be hired at a University of Pennsylvania, where you get grants and you have high-powered research programs that are hypothesis-driven, testing, basically doing a deep dive into a particular realm. The notion of joy for natural history's sake is not something, sad to say, is valued at Research One institution. I wish it were, because I actually think that natural history is more valuable than than is often recognized. And that's
I would
something.
throw out there that natural history has to be looked at through a lens of the humanities, and thinking of ourselves as part of an essential, the essential condition of the human condition is that we are immersed in a natural world.
Right,
And
absolutely.
And so I think that, let me just toot our horn here, Karin. What we're doing right now is a way to kind of say, how can we appreciate the way that this person looked at science and get value out of it today, even though the scientific community doesn't work that way anymore.
Right.
And I think the value we're getting out of is exploring these ideas.
Yeah. Well,
Really.
and the value of appreciating nature for nature's sake, as opposed to what it works in service to us, ultimately it does serve us in different ways, whether, natural history and the natural world inspires art and poetry and music, or whether natural history and an understanding of it does ultimately help with applied research. So if I want to figure out why a jellyfish glows, I want to figure out how a jellyfish glows, but understanding that now becomes something that allows us to develop a technique that revolutionized microscopy and the study of life under, at the microscopic scale. So, but the person who is studying that is not necessarily going to be that person who has those developments, or the person who wants to understand venom in a poisonous lizard doesn't necessarily turn that into a drug that becomes important for diabetes, right?
Yeah.
So, and so going back to what, is Lighty discovered, would he, when we don't, one of the problems with the way science works is we often focus on the people who made those great discoveries, those great connections. And, if I were to cite something, I would just, cite natural history as a given fact, but I wouldn't necessarily cite Lighty's paper highlighting, that he found trichinosis in a ham. So if I were just wanting to talk about a paper with trichinosis that is found in ham, I wouldn't go back and cite the original paper that Lighty described it. And
well,
so since
that's why it's important, I think, for us to have these connections, that through the humanities we can make these connections and bring the science into the dialogue with the history that's there. Understand, because some of these values are still there, right? The value of discovery, the value of observation has never gone away. We use it differently, and so we need to see it as a holistic picture, the ecology of scientific understanding, if you will.
Right. Well, and I hope that, especially if we think about somebody like Lighty, who discovered the joy of natural history, that where science is failing, and to appreciate that, we can look to his life and his approach to science and say, hey, maybe we actually need that. Maybe the rejection of him and his approach to science was not I mean, yes, we had lots of major advances, but maybe we could actually learn more by going back to that time and understanding that kind of joy and
Well, I do
discovery.
know this. I do know that there is a bit of a false dichotomy. Always, the STEM humanities
Mhm.
arts dichotomy is one that I fight against all the time, because I do see the human. I like to call it STEAM. It's my new Yiddish word, with the
I
arts
like
and
that.
humanities in there as well. But certainly, in an era and where science is just as much under attack as the humanities, I think it's
Mhm.
very important for us to bridge these gaps and
Oh, yeah.
understand that knowledge and critical thinking apply to all disciplines. Dr. Karin Pfennig, I'm so pleased you joined us, and I really hope you can join us in the spring. We won't tease anything too much right now, but
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed this experience.
Absolutely. It was really fun. Thank you.
And thank you for introducing us all to Joseph Leidy. I know I'll never forget
Great.
him. All
Great.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is our last lunch with friends and strangers. We're doing it again next semester. We did mention that we have all of these are on YouTube, so you can watch them at your leisure if you'd like. We have a wonderful selection of past programs, to which this one will be added. Karin, thank you so much. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
weekend, and
Thank you.
everyone cook your pork, okay? All right. Have a
Bye-bye.
wonderful weekend. We'll see you next time. Bye bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.